My name's Adam Clapworthy. I'm a dad. I have an amazing family, my wife Jess, and I have a daughter called Daisy, who is 8 years old, and Alfie, who is going to be turning 3 in March. Our genetics journey started really when we decided to have another child. So my wife and I were very lucky to have a daughter, Daisy, who was 4 or 5 years old at the time. And like many parents, we were in a position where we wanted to try and have another child, to give Daisy a younger sibling that she could play with and share that bond with. Lolly, as she was affectionately known by her sister Daisy, but Lola was born home birth, no complications at all. Everything had been very, very seamless. And she arrived in the early hours of the morning, and we were the happiest parents we could be. Daisy had a younger sister that she'd already become infatuated with. But it was around a week in where she still wasn't able to go to the toilet properly, so we were having to get some support with helping her to go to the toilet. And then when the midwife was checking in to see her, there were some initial concerns around like her focal, how she was fixing and following things, and she was a little bit floppy. But really it was at 3 months when she started doing very strange things with her eyes. So, and she was kind of almost like gasping for breath. They initially thought it was reflux, so she was obviously having some issues swallowing, but they were so brief and intermittent that it was very hard to capture them on camera. And the reality is, unless the doctors can see what we're talking about, it's very hard for them to explain what it could potentially be. So, but it was really at 3 months when she had her first, what we felt was a seizure, where she was doing lots of rhythmic jerking and lots of blinking episodes. But still, because they hadn't seen the seizure, they still, as parents, they weren't really saying whether it was a seizure or not. They just felt that it was something to do with reflux. So they actually started her on medication for reflux. But we knew it wasn't reflux. I think as a parent, you have that intuition. But this was really the start of the relentless in and out of hospital. I think we counted it like within the space of a few months, we'd had to call an ambulance maybe 18 times. And every time we were rushed in, and she would then stop having the seizure, and you're literally just on a ward being monitored.
I think they thought maybe because I was a nurse, I don't know, maybe thinking the worst. I think because as a nurse, you see the worst things, and they sort of maybe tried to maybe made me feel like I was exaggerating a little bit or making out things that were worse than they were.
But it was only really when we captured one of the seizures on camera, and we showed it to the consultant, and that's when they could see like the rhythmic jerking with her arm. They said, okay, we do feel like this is epilepsy and this is some kind of seizure.
Everything that I was seeing was real, and unfortunately it did turn out to be like the worst case scenario, where she was definitely having seizures, and seizures that ended up then being really, really hard to control, and didn't respond to medication at all.
But it was one night, I think it was about 1 a.m, I couldn't sleep. I was just trawling a Facebook group, and out of desperation, I just posted a video of one of Lola's seizures. And by some twist of fate, a mother who lives in Canada, her name's Katie, so they'd had a daughter who'd been diagnosed with this condition called CRELD1, the first we'd ever heard of this condition. And it's typically associated with heart defects. So their daughter, Hayden, had this condition that she was diagnosed with, and they'd sadly lost her. She'd passed away from this condition, but they'd been given a diagnosis. They then had a daughter who was perfectly healthy, similar age to Daisy, and then they'd had a son, Levi, who'd then been diagnosed with this condition, CRELD1 as well. So we both kind of lived this very similar journey, but they'd had a diagnosis, and being in Canada, they'd had access to different medical care. Levi was very similar in appearance to Lola, like there's some features that look very similar. And that's when I first took it to our consultants in the UK, and I just said, look, we've found this family in Canada, they've been diagnosed with this condition, like, could this be what Lolly has? And they were like, well, there's nothing in medical literature about Crowd 1 epilepsy. Like, we've looked in the medical literature in the UK, there was nothing online about it. So you Google Crowd 1 and epilepsy, there's nothing. So they were they didn't really treat it with any significance. It was almost like, well, what do you know? You're just parents, like, we are the experts. We'll look into it, but there's nothing we found that links it. So we after that just thought, okay, well, it's very similar, but the clinicians are telling us it's nothing for us to be looking into.
I don't know, we just felt like very deflated. It didn't really feel like they were taking what was going on seriously. We had horrible invasive tests done, like MRI scans and EEGs, where they put lots of electrodes on the head to see the brain activity. And we'd have these tests done, you wait ages for them, and then nobody gives you the results, and you're just sort of sat there trying to chase up, results that you feel like, I don't know, you feel like you're waiting up, your days just waiting to get the results and see if it can make a difference. So it felt like there was a real lack of communication and importance of actually reading, reports would go months without anyone looking at them. We'd just be sat at home waiting for like blood test results or scan results. It felt like there was a real lack of caring and importance to give us this information, even if it was just to say nothing, like nothing's come back, you just want to know.
So then Lola was, I'd say, she was approaching her 3rd birthday, and as a family, we come to the realization that we may never find out what is wrong with Lola. This may be her, and that's like, we'd grown to love her obviously as our daughter, and Daisy loved her, was infatuated with her. We may find something, but we can't live our lives just constantly like hanging up on the fact that she's not where she should be. She may never walk, she may never be able to talk, all these sorts of things. She was very floppy still, no head control, still having to deal with seizures, but we knew that was going to be a troubled life for her. And as Daisy gets older, that's a burden that she's going to have to carry as well, because the reality is she's going to feel some of that, having to support her and help her with her development. Don't get me wrong, she loved doing that, and so we decided to try and have another child. We spoke to everyone. We spoke to the neurologist, the geneticist, we spoke to nurses, and we were told essentially that she was a lightning bolt. Like, because they don't know what the condition is, the chances of it happening again are like less than 2%. So Alfie was born in the early hours of the morning in hospital, and there was some initial concerns when he was first born. He had talipes, which same as Lola. Lolly was born with talipes, and we thought, okay, again, it's still a very common condition. But he was also very quiet. He wasn't really crying. Again, Lolly came out very quiet, and so initially there's the alarm bells ringing, and I remember Jess looking at me saying, this can't happen again, this can't happen again, but this is very similar. All this while Lola she was finding herself. Obviously, we're still going through confusion about medication, and the seizures were very up and down. But it was just 4 days after Alfie arrived that one morning I went into her room and she'd stopped breathing during the night. And there was many times that we thought that might happen, but this was not one of them. But as you can imagine, it was, for me to have to go in and find my child not breathing. We tried CPR, but we knew that she'd gone during the night, and that's a common thing for children with epilepsy. They will just suddenly their heart will stop beating. But they called the air ambulance. They had a helicopter. We were bombarded. We had about 20 paramedics in the house, all trying to resuscitate her. But I knew that there was no coming back from it, and it was put down to SUDEP, which is sudden unexplained death in epilepsy. So they never really knew. Lola never had a diagnosis. They never knew what it was. But when Alfie was just 4 days old, we were dealing with concerns and angst about whether Alfie was going to be okay, then losing Lolly and still trying to give some normality to Daisy's life and trying to protect her from the whirlwind that was going on. But After going through that, we went home and we just tried to keep everything as normal as possible for Daisy. But now it's about making sure that whether Alfie's going to be okay. And it was, all the initial signs were fine. He had his 8-week checkup, which was fine. Like, he felt stronger one morning, and I remember it so vividly that Jess was holding him. I was just getting ready to go to work, and she said, "Alf's not right. There's something wrong." And he was doing some weird kind of twitching. He was very rosy. And she said, "We've got to call an ambulance. This is not right. This can't happen again." I just remember her looking at me saying, we can't lose another child. We can't go through this again. And then that was just the start of his seizures. They ramped up really quickly. All while this is going on, we're thinking that there's something to this CRELD1 condition. We went back to Katie and just said and she was just like, "I'm heartbroken for you," but she's like, "This sounds so similar to the journey we went on." And she said, you've got to look into CRELD1. You've got to get at the geneticists and to test for this condition. Access really wasn't an issue with the NHS. It was more like the time involved, because there was such a long waiting list.
You know, sort of, just as a parent, it's so frustrating when you know things are out there and, you know, but you can't, you know, you have to wait, or you have to access them. You know, you have to wait to access them. It's really frustrating and really heartbreaking as well at the same time.
And it's then we found out you can get it done privately. So they essentially test for all known conditions on their database, and then they'll revisit that every year. And I remember the geneticist came back and she replied almost instantly and said, "I'm obviously so sorry to hear that you're going through this again. What makes you think there's something to this CRELD? There's no link. It's only associated with heart conditions." And I said, "I don't care. We just have to test for it." And I remember she called back within a couple of days and said, "We've gone back into Lola's blood sample and we've found irregularities with CRELD1." And I just remember thinking, like, why didn't I push for this sooner? She was very humble and said, "Look, this goes to show the importance of, like, the parents in finding a diagnosis." She said, "I've never had this happen before, that a parent has come to us with like an unknown condition and found like all this backstory." And she said, she obviously apologized for not taking it more seriously, but she said, "You also have to understand that there's so many different conditions out there that don't actually come to anything. So we have to make sure we've got all the facts before we go into like formal testing." But I still like totally understand that they have limited resources and they are time poor, and we know all about the stress and the kind of demand on the NHS right now. But I think working in partnership with the parents, you have to, because we're with our child 24/7. We're going to pick up on certain things that there's no way that they can see them in the brief interactions they have with the child. So if I think to all the times you're in hospital with Lolly and a couple of times with Alfie, they're only seeing your child for like maybe 10, 15 minutes at a time. They're not going to see all the rest of his life and what he's doing. Is he eating properly? Is he feeding properly? Like, is he like moving properly? Are there little twitches that we should be aware of? So absolutely, I think for them to be asking questions of us and showing that we want to work together to find a solution, and rather than it just being like an us and them thing and, oh, we can do that and there's this, but what do you think? Like, how are there routes that you would like to take, or how can we just learn from you, really? And it kind of felt like, look, if we hadn't have decided to have Alfie, would we have ever found a diagnosis for Lolly? And I often ask myself that, because I think if we'd decided not to have another child, we would probably not have researched into Lolly's condition anymore.
We were fortunate, I guess, in a way, to find out what the name of his condition was, and it's, as much as it's sort of like it was the worst news in the world at the time, it's really helped us, we feel, to like provide the best that we can for him, and we're armed with a little bit more information than we were. I think with Lola, I felt very alone. Well, we as a family, we felt very alone, and you know, there was nobody in the world who I could turn to who understood what we were going through and sort of almost the nightmare that we were living with her. You know, she was in and out of hospital. We were trying all sorts of different treatments. We just felt like, I don't know, we just didn't know what to do for the best with her. But I think with Alfie, because we had that diagnosis from fairly early on in his life, we just felt like we were armed with so much more knowledge and information and support. We found another neurologist and at King's Hospital, and the experience was totally different. Like, we felt like we had someone who cared. We felt like someone who thought it was important to find out what was going on. If we had a test done, we felt like we had a contact to get hold of the results, or he would, you know, straight away give us the results, and it was a completely different experience. And unfortunately, it was quite late in my daughter's life that we had that, but we knew when Alfie started to present with the same symptoms that we felt we trusted this doctor with Alfie and his life, and to help us navigate this condition. You know, it didn't, you know, he was like us, not knowing much about it because it's so rare, but at least you felt like someone was listening to you, and that was just, yeah, like really important to us, and it makes such a huge difference to our lives. And you know, we have an epilepsy nurse that we feel like we can email. She responds to us. Like, you know, it's not that much. I know that these like clinicians have a huge caseload and you know, and a huge workload, because I've been there myself and I know how busy it can be. But being on the other side and being a parent, like knowing that somebody is going to read your email and respond within even a couple of days, it makes such a huge difference.
What do we know about CRELD1? Well, what we do know is that it's a protein coding gene. So it's typically associated with heart defects. So if you Google CRELD1, that's typically what you'd find information about is issues with the heart. But what we found out is that different sequence changes in that gene have now been associated with, firstly, epilepsy, which is where we've discovered, but also like developmental delay, underdeveloped, like low tone of like muscles, and like lack of mobility, obviously, which explains the lack of head control. But it can also cause, what we found is with the other families and their children, is they're all very different, but there's the common theme of the seizures.
I feel scared, but I feel like Alfie's strong, and he puts, you know, he's like, same with all the children with this condition, they're very resilient, and sometimes it seems like no matter what you throw at them, they just fight it, and they want to be here. You know, at the minute he's still like our little boy and he's a baby, but obviously it's scary having a child that's, you know, neurologically diverse and not neurotypical, because it's sort of scary thinking about what his life looks like in the future and what things he's going to need and how the world is going to not be as accessible to us as other people.
Sadly, the reality is that other children in the community are suffering. Like, how can we use this example of not being listened to, but then make sure it happens for no other family? Like, no other family should be essentially not ignored, but kind of not being treated seriously just because there's not an official paper online about this condition. How do we make them feel like they're not on their own? I built a website just to help people have a central resource to go to, so that they don't have the experience that I had when I Googled CRELD1 and epilepsy and nothing came up. Now, through building the website, I only built it, I think it was just over a year ago. When you type CRELD1 and epilepsy, that website comes up as top of the rankings, because I understand how websites work and search rankings. And everyone's got their story on there, so you can understand who we all are, like what's the background, like the personalities and the people that are behind this genetic condition. They're not just CRELD1 children. They all have their own stories. So, and making sure that we've now had this paper published with Yale School of Medicine means that it's officially recognised by the medical community. So anytime a child is going to have genetics testing now, CRELD1 is part of that gene panel because of that paper. That's taken like 2-3 years of like working together with the team at Yale to understand more about this condition and connecting with scientists in the UK and like That's opening now potential for us to start looking into treatment options. The reality is we probably won't see the fruits of that in our lifetime, but it's one step in that long road to hopefully finding some kind of treatment option for what is an extremely rare condition.